Hey, what's going on there, guys? I'm coming back to you here today with another deck tech. So today I am going to be showing you a standard deck, and it is actually the deck that I used for the Star City Games Classic in Pittsburgh on May 11th, 2013. So I actually only had one round loss for the day at that event, and it was up against Naya Blitz. But the deck that I'm showing you here today is Solar Flare. So Solar Flare is a 3-color combination deck. It's Esper colored, and it's blue, white, and black for those of you that are unfamiliar with Esper. And basically, this deck is a Reanimator-style control deck that has control proportions for being able to maintain what our opponent's doing in either casting creatures or being able to counter their spells and things so that they don't resolve. And also we have the Reanimator proportions where it allows us to have a sizable advantage from getting things like Griselbrand, Sphinx of Uthuun, Aetherling, and Stormtide Leviathan into our grave, and being able to cast them earlier with Unburial Rites, either by just casting Unburial Rites from our hand or getting Unburial Rites into our grave and then flashing it back for one less mana with the flashback cost of it. So we're going to get this started here, but before we do that, if you guys have any suggestions for decks that you would like to see, please leave them down in the comments below. Now, the biggest thing with building this deck was to have a Reanimator-style Solar Flare list in the main board and then have a transformational sideboard. So we side out all the Reanimator stuff. Game 2, if we've revealed that we've been playing Unburial Rites. So the biggest thing is that you want to show your opponent that you're playing Unburial Rites game 1 and that you want to have a really good game 1 and potentially win it. And usually with Reanimator style decks, you should be able to win game 1 pretty easily. It's game 2 and game 3 that get tough with Reanimator decks because your opponent starts siding in Graveyard Hate. But with this deck, we want to reveal that we're playing Reanimator game 1 so that game 2 we can switch and we side out all the Reanimator things, and then we just start playing Esper Control. So I'll show you guys the sideboard after we get through the main board here. But basically with the creatures that we have, starting off we have Obzedat. So with Obzedat, he's efficient because we can either use him as a reanimation target if we have him in the grave, or we can just easily cast him. He's only 5 mana, which makes him pretty efficient. 5/5 for 5. And with his Enter the Battlefield ability, he's going to drain our opponent 2 life, and we gain 2 life each time he enters in. We can exile him at the end of our turn. He comes back during our upkeep, so we can kind of cycle that through where we just keep on draining our opponent. He also has haste when he enters back in, so he's bashing on our opponent, and we can just kind of keep that going. And we can also keep ourselves in the game if we're taking life loss each turn, and we can just kind of cushion out any damage that we've already taken or any damage that we might take off of Obzedat. But in up against decks that are using removal that doesn't exile our creatures, even if Obzedat dies, we can just reanimate him, which makes him pretty useful, especially with his Enter the Battlefield abilities. The next creature that we have is Aetherling, and Aetherling is actually probably one of my favorite cards in this deck, and one of my favorite cards out of Dragon's Maze. He's a 4/5 for 6 with 4 abilities. The first one allowing us to exile him and return to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. The second one is to make him unblockable, and the final 2 are clashing abilities. The first one allowing to give +1, -1, and the second one allowing us to grant -1, +1. So we can either buff the defense or buff the power. If we buff one, it makes the other one smaller. But basically with Aetherling, Aetherling is probably one of the most resilient cards in the format, just because he can survive wraths, he can survive spot removal. He's just absolutely amazing. You can swing in with him, make him unblockable, buff him up, make him 8 power, and just bash your opponent. And then you can blink him with 1 blue, and you can have him as a blocker next turn. And there's just so many scenarios with Aetherling that just makes him really good, and I really love having him in the deck. He's one of the biggest win conditions for this deck, just making him unblockable, buffing him up, and then being able to blink him in and out whenever I feel it fitting, whether it's removal or wraths or anything like that going on, or even if I want to have him as a blocker and then blink him out so that he doesn't die. Then we have Sphinx of Uthuun, so Fact or Fiction Sphinx. 5/6 for 7 with flying, so whenever he enters the battlefield, Fact or Fiction basically happens for us. We reveal the top 5 cards of our library. An opponent separates them into 2 piles. We put one into our hand, the other one goes to our graveyard. So we get to pick things based on the scenario. So if we need a spell like Sphinx's Revelation or an Azorius Charm to combat what our opponent's trying to do, with Sphinx's Revelation if we need to gain life in the following turn, or Azorius Charm if we want to bounce one of our opponent's creatures if they're attacking. We can also get Syncopate if we want to counter something as well. Or we can go and grab Unburial Rites if it's in there, if we already have creatures, that way allowing us to play Unburial Rites and then have it as a flash the following turn and be in our graveyard. But Sphinx of Uthuun ultimately just kind of goes towards this deck and plays into it more, where we can get things that we need into our hand if we need them, and we can allow ourselves to put things into our grave that we don't need or we want to play later on if we're playing off of Reanimator things. Then I have Stormtide Leviathan, which seems like an awkward card, and it was probably one of the most unexpected cards to see, especially with most of my matchups. A lot of people weren't expecting me to reanimate Stormtide Leviathan, and even when I had it put into my graveyard, it was just one of the most unusual things for them to see being played across the table from them. But Stormtide Leviathan is actually really good. 8/8 for 8 Island Walk. All lands are islands in addition to their other types, and creatures without flying or Island Walk can attack. The biggest thing about Stormtide Leviathan is the last part of it, is creatures without flying or Island Walk can't attack. So my basic mindset was up against the Naya Blitz matchups and really, really aggressive aggro decks that don't have flying proportions. I can reanimate Stormtide Leviathan, and I can pretty much be assured that they don't have very many ways or any way at all to deal with Stormtide Leviathan, and I can pretty much leave myself an out where I can just win the game just by having Stormtide Leviathan out there and not having to do much else. My opponent can't attack or anything like that. So that was the basic logic behind Stormtide Leviathan, and he's been working very well. He does side out a lot against a lot of different matchups just because it's very subpar in a lot of matchups, but against the aggro decks game 1, Stormtide Leviathan ends up being very, very perfect. Then I have Griselbrand 2 of. So Griselbrand is a 7/7 for 8 with flying lifelink, and we can pay 7 life and draw 7 cards. So with Griselbrand, he's really good with lifelink. It allows us to stay in the game and counteract any damage. With his pay 7, draw 7, we are able to draw things that we need. Detention Spheres to get rid of our opponent's things, Syncopates or Azorius Charms to act on the situation that's at hand if our opponent's attacking with creatures and they Blood Rush or something like that, Gore Clan Rampage or Blood Rush on something or something like that, then we can draw 7 off of Griselbrand and resolve things based on what we draw, hopefully. And most times with Griselbrand, when you draw 7, you're going to get, you're usually going to get the thing that you need, or at least get really close to it. So Griselbrand allows you to draw massive amounts of cards while also being a flying lifelink 7/7 creature that is just absolutely immense. Then we have our Planeswalkers. So I have 3 Liliana of the Veil, and Liliana is going to allow us to discard things out of our hands. So she's going to allow us to discard creatures and also things like Unburial Rites from our hand, and allow us to kind of have synergy out of that while forcing our opponent to discard things as well. Around that, if we're playing up against control, we can still use her even if we're not playing around our Reanimator things. We can still use her to force control players to get rid of things out of their hand, thus dwindling down the amount of things that they have in their hand and leaving them less things to play off of, which is always good. Control against control, having a decent outlet of things in your hand and responses that you can possibly use is pretty important with control. So making us disrupt what they're doing and making them discard is pretty important for us. The -2 is also fairly relevant as well, forcing us to make our opponent sack a creature, which is pretty nice up against the non-super aggressive aggro decks, not where they're just playing threats every single time and they have multiple things on the board when we're playing Lily. But Lily ultimately is the biggest synergy that we have with getting things under our grave really easily and on command while forcing our opponent to discard things as well. Then we have Jace Memory Adept as a 2-up. So Jace is here basically as a win condition or as a synergy for us to get things into our grave. I have milled myself many times with Jace with the 0 ability, getting cards into my grave that I could then reanimate, like Griselbrand or Stormtide Leviathan in the case of Naya Blitz in one of the games out of our 3 games that we played. So Jace Memory Adept allowing me to mill myself is going to give me things into my grave that I can potentially cast, recast, like Lingering Souls if I need blockers. But Jace can also be used to mill out my opponent if I have a clear chance to do so. I can just start milling my opponent and just get them to 0 cards in their library and win that way. So he kind of has two sides to him, where I can either use him towards my advantage of milling myself and getting a bit synergy out of that, or just milling out my opponent. Then we have Sphinx's Rev, so 3 Sphinx's Revelation, gain X amount of life and draw X amount of cards. Pretty straightforward for control-based decks. Anything that's running like Esper colors or blue-white is generally going to be running Sphinx's Revelation and using it to be able to draw and gain life. It's a really, really useful card in those types of decks. We have 3 Azorius Charms to either cycle it and draw a card. We can bounce one of our opponent's creatures if they're attacking or blocking, depends on the situation, or we can give our creatures lifelink. I don't use that very often, but sometimes the opportunity's open and it's key if we need to gain back life off of something that doesn't usually have lifelink, like Stormtide Leviathan, Sphinx of Uthuun, or even Aetherling. If we buff it up big enough, we can gain back 8 life off of it. So Azorius Charm allows us to do things however we want. But most times I'm finding myself cycling them and drawing cards off of it and accelerating myself along a little bit. Then we have Syncopate as a 2-of, so counter spells. It's not as amazing against control as it is against mid-range style decks, but ultimately having 2 counter spells is pretty alright for us in this deck. We want to have at least some control and counter proportions to this deck. Then we have Forbidden Alchemy as a 4-of, so Forbidden Alchemy allows us to look at the top 4 cards of our library, put 1 into our hand, the rest into our grave, so we kind of get to pick and choose what we want, and the rest is going to go to our grave, and we just kind of play off the situation based on what we need and what we're going to be playing off of in the next following, like, 2 or 3 turns. Then we have Lingering Souls, allowing us to make 2/2s with flying, and it has a flashback. So basically Lingering Souls is the biggest way to have chump blockers and allow us to stall until we get bigger things that we can play, and we can just kind of gain more momentum on our opponent without having to take life loss, or very much of it at least. So Lingering Souls is mainly used as a stall until we can do other things, but post-sideboard, when we start siding in Sorin, it can be used as more of a aggressive proponent to the deck. And then we have Detention Sphere as a 2-of, so exiling things, planeswalkers, enchantments, creatures. It just depends on what we're playing against. It can be used for multiple things and gets rid of multiple copies with the same name. Then we have Unburial Rites, so the biggest combo piece of the deck, allowing us to reanimate a creature from our graveyard for 5 mana and flashback for 4. And then we have Supreme Verdict as a 4-of, so destroy all creatures and it can't be countered. And we want to have proportions where up against like aggro we can just Wrath, or even if we have our own creatures on the board, we can still Wrath and we can still use Unburial Rites to get our things back if our opponent has a huge board state that we can't overcome except by Wrathing. And then we have our land base for the deck, so I'm only running 24 lands here, and it's been working perfectly fine with the 24. I was actually thinking about going up to 25, but I've otherwise just been staying at 24, and it's been working really well towards all the land drops that I need, all the colors that I need, specifically when I actually want them, like double white, double black for Obzedats and things like that, or triple or quadruple black for Griselbrand. I don't have problems with colors or anything like that, or land drops, so it's been working fine with 24. But the land base breaks down into a playset of each of the shocks, so a playset of Watery Grave, playset of Hallowed Fountain, and a playset of Godless Shrine. And then for the other dual lands, I have a playset of Drowned Catacomb, 3 Glacial Fortress, 3 Isolated Chapel, and 2 Nephalia Drownyard. The Nephalia Drownyard either allowing us to mill out our opponent, or again mill out ourselves if we want synergy off of reanimation targets, or going into things like Lingering Souls. So that's the main board. Now let's take a look at what we have here for the sideboard. So for our sideboard here, the thing that I mentioned when talking about the main board was that I have a transformational board, And with that, we're going to be siding out Unburial Rites and then siding in other things. So the three basic things that I always kind of side in against the Unburial Rites that are going out are going to be the 2 Sorin, Lord of Innistrad, and the Tamiyo, the Moon Sage. So whenever I go and reveal game 1 that I'm playing Unburial Rites, I'm going to make the adjustments and start playing Sorin and Tamiyo, and then based on what matchup I have, I'm going to kind of make adjustments with the rest of the things in the sideboard. So with the rest of the things, I have 2 Snapcaster Mage, which is going to allow us to flashback the things that we have in our graveyard. So this is going to be very essential in the matchups like Jund Midrange, and the Control and Flash variants, where we can start flashing in things like Negate if we need to start countering things. Also Syncopate, Azorius Charm if we want to start drawing more off of it and start cycling it more and gain advantage from that. Snapcaster Mage can also be used as a aggressive card very early on if we are able to just flash him in turn 2 and start bashing our opponent and put pressure on them to actually do things, especially if they're not running Lingering Souls. That's one of the biggest things, where I can flash in Snapcaster Mage and force them to use something like a Supreme Verdict if they kept it in, or like a Detention Sphere, just to get rid of the Snapcaster Mage before he deals a pretty huge amount of damage. But Snapcaster Mage more so is just going to be used as a outlet to gain advantage off the things that are in our graveyard, like Syncopate, Negate, and Azorius Charm. Then we have Sorin, Lord of Innistrad. So Sorin allows us to make 1/1s with lifelink. He can make a emblem where creatures we control get +1/+0, and his -6 blows up to 3 target creatures and or planeswalkers, and then we get to return each of those to the battlefield under our control. So Sorin ultimately is just an easy way for us to get a board state up against the kind of slower matchups, and also pretty much up against anything where we're just going transformational. It allows us to get that board state. If we're playing around our Lingering Souls and our opponent doesn't have ways of blocking them, we can go more aggressively and start making emblems and just kind of win off of that. But ultimately, Sorin, you just kind of play around the deck in the scenario based on what outs you're going to have. Like if your opponent's playing a lot of creatures, you might want to use your tokens as a stall for whenever you get a Wrath, and you could Wrath and then play other things. But it really just depends on the situation. But Sorin ends up just being a good way to make tokens and also have a aggressive aspect to the deck where we can just make those emblems. Tamiyo allows us to tap down permanents and keep them tapped down with a +1. The -2 lets us draw cards equal to the amount of tapped creatures target player controls, and -8 gives us that emblem where we don't have a maximum hand size. Whenever a card's put into our graveyard from anywhere, we can put it into our hands. So Tamiyo ultimately ends up being really nice. We can keep things like Nephalia Drownyards, Kessig Wolfruns tapped down if our opponent has those. We can keep them off of double colors, like double blue, if we're playing up against like Bant or even like Esper Control, if it means getting them off of playing a Dissipate instead of like having Negate open or something like that. Tamiyo ends up being really, really good in just allowing us to keep specific things tapped down based on the scenario that we're in. And ultimately for control, she's a really good planeswalker to have. Then we have Blood Baron of Vizkopa. So Blood Baron is one card that I find myself siding in against numerous matchups. I really like him up against a lot of the Bant decks. I like him against Flash, against Control, against Jund. The biggest thing with him is the fact that he has pro-white and pro-black and a lifelink. So he's a 4/4 for 5, lifelink pro-white, pro-black, and as long as we have 30 or more life and our opponent is at 10 or less life, he gets +6/+6, making him a 10/10, and has flying, which makes him just absolutely absurd. But the Blood Baron is nice because they can't get rid of him by putting him on top of our library with Azorius Charm. They can't Detention Sphere him. They can't block him with Lingering Souls. They can't block him with Restoration Angel. They can't block him with Boros Reckoner. There's just so many things. Even in Jund, they can't use Putrefy, Murder. They can't use any of those black removal spells that they possibly have. Even Olivia Voldaren can't target him and take control of him. There are just so many things that make Blood Baron really, really good, and I really love having him and being able to side him. He's another one of my favorite cards out of Dragon's Maze. Then we have Cyclonic Rift just as a one-up. Cyclonic Rift was mainly just being able to play up against Jund, and whenever they play Sire of Insanity, whenever they go and it comes to the end of their turn and Sire of Insanity's ability is put onto the stack, I can use Cyclonic Rift and bounce all of my opponent's things back to their hand and they discard everything. So that was kind of my response to that. I actually didn't play against Jund at all at the Star City Games Classic, but Cyclonic Rift was a card that I sided in playing up against Bant Hexproof in being able to bounce back my opponent's things, and I mainly used it on Luxodon Smiter just to bounce back Luxodon Smiter, and there was also Avacyn's Pilgrim that my opponents used to put on Rancors and stuff like that. So up against those creatures that weren't hexproof and I could actually target, Cyclonic Rift was a nice way to just bounce that back to their hand. All their enchantments go to the grave, so it wasn't bad for that. But if we want to overload it up against those types of matchups, so we can just bounce everything back to their hand, especially if they're not attacking, if they're keeping things back, and we don't want to swing for fear of being attacked. Cyclonic Rift allows us to just bounce everything back, and it doesn't target, and it just clears the field open for us. Then we have the 2 Terminus for the aggro matchups, putting all creatures on the bottom of their owner's libraries. The Miracle makes it really awesome. We can Miracle it off for 1 white, and we just get an advantage out of it. We can still play other things. We don't have to pay the 6 mana that it regularly costs to cast it. We have the Tuna Gates for countering non-creature spells, so against Flash, up against the mid-range deck's control, any type of control variants, anything with a lot of non-creature spells, we're just going to side that in and try to counter the big things that they're trying to play. Especially things like Sphinx's Revelation. We don't want to allow them to play off of Sphinx's Revelation and get a whole lot of card advantage there. And then we have Purify the Grave. So Purify the Grave is the last card here as a 3 of, and that's up against the Reanimator style decks. And sometimes if I'm playing against something that has a pretty good utility out of using their graveyard, anything that has synergy out of their graveyard, I want to use Purify the Grave as well. But instant for 1 white, exile target card from a graveyard. We can respond to Unburial Rites with it, and it also has a flashback for 1 white as well, so it's not bad for that either. So that is our sideboard, and that is the deck tech for Solar Flare. If you guys enjoyed it, please be sure to like and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content. Leave any suggestions for other deck techs that you would like to see in the comments below. And until next time, guys, peace out.